Yes.
It'll be about 2 hours.
Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Kerry Colonisi. I am on the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and I direct the Penn Program on Regulation. And we're pleased to welcome you to today's workshop on understanding regulation's impact on employment. I want to thank, first of all, Mr. Cohen for sponsoring the room and for the House Judiciary Committee and its staff for helping us put together today's workshop. This is a workshop aimed at reviewing the academic research, some of the latest academic research on the relationship between regulation and jobs. Now, I don't probably need to dwell a whole lot on the importance of this issue to folks who are here in the room. As an academic, though, I like numbers and went to the major newspapers and looked at the number of times that the word jobs was mentioned in close conjunction with regulation over the last 10 years. And the slide on the screen, if you're able to discern the pattern of the blue number, that's the number of mentions in the media. And the red line actually tracks the unemployment rate over the last roughly 10 years. And with a little bit of a lag, you can see that the salience of this issue for the last 10 years has very closely tracked the economic circumstances. And obviously, in the wake of the Great Recession, these circumstances have been dire for many Americans who have been finding themselves out of work and out of work on a long-term basis in record numbers. Now, much of the concern about the relationship between regulation and jobs has centered on the loss of jobs associated with regulations. One example, just to make this concrete, the Washington Post in 2010 featured a story about a General Electric factory that makes incandescent light bulbs that was closing down. It was a facility in Virginia. It lost a couple of hundred jobs as the facility closed, ostensibly in response to the new energy efficiency standards for light bulbs that were in place for the 2007 Energy Independence and Security Act. Now, this concern about regulation eliminating jobs or making it hard for the economy to rebound and jobs to grow has given rise to a number of legislative proposals. Just last summer, for example, as many of you know, the House passed H.R. 4078, which would have placed a moratorium on new significant regulations until the unemployment rate dropped to 6%. Now, which incidentally, if that legislation had passed, we still aren't at that level of unemployment at 6%. There's also a countervailing set of claims in the popular discourse and in the political dialogue about regulation actually helping to create jobs. The so-called claim of green jobs is a claim that regulation actually encourages firms to innovate. It creates new jobs and new fields of technology that are called for by regulation. So the question really here is, well, which is it? Which set of claims is indeed accurate? And one thing is clear is that when one looks at the academic literature, the relationship between regulation and jobs is more complex than it's portrayed in popular political discourse. The published peer-reviewed studies tend to show either that there is no statistically significant relationship between regulation and jobs, or that that relationship is rather modest. And certainly not at a level that would amount to a substantial difference in terms of policy making. But the number of studies up until about a year or so ago was rather small and limited. And certainly the focus has been in all this literature on a number of jobs, and there may be other impacts that regulation has on jobs in terms of wages and quality of jobs. We commissioned at the Penn Program on Regulation a series of papers last year and held 2 workshops, one in Washington, D.C. and one in Philadelphia, which we brought together a number of leading scholars to focus on different facets of this relationship. The empirical papers that we had as part of this process tended to confirm the existing peer-reviewed literature as well. One study which I quoted there before, there on the board, indicating that the effects by and large are maybe statistically significant but substantively small. That's in a book that will be coming out by the end of the year called, the title of it is called Does Regulation Kill Jobs? And many of the panel members here are contributors to that book. And I think it's also quite fair to say that we have a wide range of views reflected among both the panel members here and across the chapters in the book. So what we have planned today is to start with one panel which will focus on what do we understand from the research literature, both theoretically and empirically, about the relationship between regulation and jobs, thinking about, again, both the impacts on employment, the number of jobs, wages, quality of employment, but also not just the numerical impacts, but also the welfare value. What, at the end of the day, can we say about the real effects on human beings and their welfare from any changes in employment or shifts in jobs associated with regulation? So to sort out these issues, the first panel, as I say, will focus on what does the research literature show, and the second panel will focus on, well, at this juncture, what should regulatory agencies be doing differently with respect to analyzing the employment effects of regulation. I want to introduce first the panel members from panel 1 and then turn things over to them. We're going to go in the order that's listed in your program, and if you didn't pick one up, there's copies by the door along with the cookies and the water, so please help yourself to any of those materials. The first panel member, Keith Hall, is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And you have a full bios of the speakers on the program. I wanted to add to what is listed there that Keith is also the author of a March 2013 Mercatus Center working paper entitled The Employment Costs of Regulation. Following Keith, Joe Aldi will be speaking. Joe is on the faculty of the Harvard Kennedy School. He's also a non-resident fellow at Resources for the Future and a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He is the co-author of the forthcoming paper in the edited volume, Does Regulation Kill Jobs? The paper is The Employment and Competitiveness Impacts of Power Sector Regulations. And finally, moving down the table, Tim Bartik will speak. He's the senior economist at the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research in Kalamazoo, Michigan. He's written a recent article called Including Jobs in Benefit Cost Analysis. 2012. He's also written a recent working paper in March of this year called The Social Costs of Jobs Lost Due to Environmental Regulations. I will turn this over to our panel members. They'll speak first for 12 to 15 minutes each. We will then open things up to your questions and discussion. Thank you very much for being here. Keith?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, I'll get started. My slide will pop up. I want to start with a couple of slides that are just really basic things, but it's good reminders. My first slide is going to be reasons for regulation. It's going to be listing out the sort of market failures that can exist, that regulation can be targeted to fix.
For some reason, it's not showing.
The reason I mention that is so often regulations talked about as if it's just always a plus. More regulation is always better. And you can kind of forget the regulation needs to be there for a reason. There should be a goal behind the regulation and some idea of how that goal is going to be met by the regulation. I'm actually fairly new to looking at regulation, but what I've seen, especially from the agencies when they do their regulation impact analysis, they very seldom tell you what the goal of the regulation is and how a regulation, or a change of regulation, is going to meet that goal. I think that's a problem. I think they should focus on that. The second thing, and this is why you look at regulation to begin with, is again, this is another obvious thing, I think. Poorly designed regulation can have some really bad effects. It can lead to lower productivity, lower economic growth, could permanently raise unemployment, can damage investment in entrepreneurship, reduce competition, and there's research that shows this. And this is a reason why you do an analysis of the impact of regulation. And here's something that maybe is less obvious until you see it. Even good regulation has a cost. So it's not just bad regulation has a cost, but any regulation, there's a cost component to it. It may well be that the benefits exceed the cost. In fact, you want to be sure that the benefits exceed the cost. But also, you want to try to reach your goal. This is why I mentioned the reasons for regulation. You want to try to reach your goal with minimizing the economic cost of reaching that goal. And green jobs, to me, is a really good example of how not to think about regulation. All right? Green jobs are not a goal. Regulations are not a hiring program. A goal of regulation is not to hire as many people as possible into green jobs. Now, if you want to judge the quality, for example, of environmental regulation, you look at the output. Is the output there? Are you accomplishing something? And your goal actually should be to achieve your goal with as little resources as possible. In other words, you want to actually reduce your green job employment from regulation. Because fundamentally, keep in mind, labor is a valuable, scarce resource. And when you hire people into doing a green job, that's a reflection of the cost of the regulation, not the benefit. So I find it very funny. When I was at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we developed a program where we started measuring green jobs. Well, that's a measurement to some degree of the cost of regulation. It's not part of the goal of regulation. And I think that gets forgotten. Certainly when people talk about green jobs, it's almost like, well, regulation, we get cleaner environment and we get more people working. What could be bad about that? People in green jobs aren't doing something else, right? Unless you think somehow that everybody who's hired into a green job is completely unemployable elsewhere. That's just not true. So let's talk about the types of employment effects. Sort of three categories. First is macroeconomic dynamic effects. And to me, this is where the most compelling research that makes you worry about the effects of regulation comes from the macroeconomic dynamic effects, where you're comparing the effects of regulation from different countries. When the level is too high, you can see differences between countries and etc. And all the dynamic effects are, I'll go back a couple of slides, poorly designed regulation. Those are all dynamic effects, right? Where you get permanently lower GDP growth if your regulation gets too high, that sort of thing. But here's the unfortunate thing about the macroeconomic effects. is that there's not something you can do for every regulation change. In fact, it's really hard to estimate the regulation effects on the macroeconomic dynamic aspects. And certainly I don't blame regulatory agencies for not doing this, because it's very hard to do. You know, we're talking about things like matching the skills of your workforce with labor demand. You know, it can have impact on long-run labor force participation or unemployment or wage growth, that sort of thing. And my last thing is something that's perhaps an issue when you constantly look at regulation sort of one change at a time. Each change itself is a very, very small impact on the macro economy or the dynamic economy. But when you aggregate them all up, it can maybe be a significant effect. The old death of 1,000 cuts. Each one by itself is insignificant. You don't measure it, but it can add up over time. That's certainly what research shows. So one of the things, of course, would suggest that you need to occasionally go back and look at your level of regulations and look at regulations in big chunks rather than looking at every little change. All right, second type of effect from regulation would be this on the labor market. It would be a long-run reallocation of labor. Right, and the way to look at this is to look at the opportunity cost of your labor being where it is. And part of the cost and part of the benefit, but part of the cost, for example, can involve decreased use of labor or increased use of labor. Part of the benefit can be increased use of labor or decreased use of labor. It's not obvious. So part of the point here is you can't just job count. That's an inappropriate way to look at the long-run cost, labor market cost of regulation. The right way to look at it is in terms of opportunity cost. You know, when, for example, an agency looks at as a lost market surplus, or like a consumer surplus loss, or dead weight losses. Well, the reallocation of labor is part of that. You can probably separate it out if you wanted to, but at least it's in the long run. And a lot of the modeling is under full employment assumptions. And that's probably reasonable if you're looking at just the long-run effects. And then you're doing a good job of looking at the market surplus kind of impact of a regulation. And you know, agencies use things like simulation models, etc. That's a reasonable thing to look at when you're looking at long-run impacts. Just to be clear, job counting doesn't really make sense when you're looking at the long-run impact on the labor market. And again, you may want to think of, for example, compliance hiring. If you're in an industry that becomes more regulated, and the industry has to hire people for compliance, that is not a benefit. That's part of the economic cost. Because you're pulling valuable resources from other industries into this industry. And keep in mind, when you're doing that, a number of things are happening. Costs in the industry are going up, productivity is going down, you're getting more labor, output is going down, and prices are going up. So it's part of the cost. Production job losses. When you have a regulated industry, once you have costs going up and prices going up, output goes down in an industry, you have a loss of jobs. That's also part of the cost. And one of the things I've seen done, particularly by the EPA, is absolutely terrible economics. It's terrible. They go into an industry and make some sort of estimate and say, hey, look, the number of jobs created through compliance is about the same as the number of jobs lost through production, so there's no employment impact. All right, you're taking one cost and subtracting it from another cost and finding out it's zero, so there's no cost. It's terrible economics. That's absolutely not the way to look at it. In fact, some of the research that focuses on the level of employment in an industry as regulation goes up, if you observe the level of employment doesn't change much over time. All right, that's fine. That just means, though, that the compliance hiring is about the same as the lost production jobs. All right, that does not mean there's no economic cost to that. It's the opposite. In fact, what it's doing is it's masking job loss. When you have a loss of production jobs, you have a loss of output, you have a loss of jobs, you have higher prices. And that's all being masked by this notion of, well, you're hiring some people. And to take it to the absurd level, again, if you make people work construction with spoons instead of construction equipment, you hire a lot of people. That's not increasing your economic performance. It's the opposite. And another point of this as well, which I think is perhaps underappreciated with regulation, is indirect effects can be much larger than direct effects. You certainly see this in trade, but economics is the same as with regulation. If regulation raises cost in industry, output's reduced, prices up. Prices up. You now have other industries that purchase the product, you now have higher costs. You now have reduced buying power by consumers. So the indirect effects can be pretty significant. And that's underappreciated. Lots of times, at least what I've seen when agencies do their work, they don't look at the indirect effects. And the indirect effects, I think, as a general rule, the indirect effects are bigger than the direct effects. And let me make a point here, too. I'm just making a point about, actually through my whole talk, about the cost side. Right? Agencies do a lot of work in the benefit side. I'm just talking about getting the cost part right. A lot of these things apply for the benefit side as well. But I think they're ignored, and I think there's a bit of a bias sometimes on the cost side that's not fully appreciated. And one more aspect, I got my slides out of order a little bit, is I think it's completely unappreciated perhaps in regulation impact, is there can be regressive effects of regulation. The primary effect of regulation is to raise prices. And when you get the indirect effect and you raise prices, you raise the cost of things. Well, raising the cost of things has, I would say as a general rule, a regressive effect in terms of purchasers, who the consumers are that have lower buying power. This has not been, I haven't seen much work at all in regulation on this aspect of the cost of regulation, even though it's sometimes agencies are sort of directed to look at that when it's important, but they don't. Third aspect, which I think is not done at all by agencies, is the cost of unemployment. So you've got the long run, sort of the macroeconomic dynamic effects, which affects your growth of your economy. You've got the second long run effect, which means you've got things shifted around, you've got labor redistributed. But the third thing is how it gets redistributed. So you may observe, for example, that an industry that's regulated and regulation increases, that over time, the employment level doesn't change. What that maps is it almost always creates unemployment in the meantime, and people have periods of unemployment where they have to find new work. And of course, the job displacement is just simple economics, right? You raise the regulation in an industry, it lowers productivity, lowers output, higher costs and higher prices. And you have production workers losing jobs. There's no reason to expect, by the way, that workers who are hired for compliance are the same people that lost the production jobs. Probably not the same people, as a matter of fact. So the fact that 10,000 people lost jobs, but 10,000 people got jobs and they're different people, doesn't mean there's no employment effect. Right? And there is a large and growing literature on the economic cost of unemployment. Right? A lot of work on regulation just assumes full employment. They're just looking at the long run effects. If that was always appropriate, we would not worry about recessions. Because everybody's going to get a job again, why worry about a recession? Because unemployment is costly. And there's a large and growing literature on the economic cost of unemployment. And it tells you a few things. Almost anybody who's unemployed has a permanent loss of earnings. The cost is much higher in a bad labor market than in not a bad labor market. Twice as much, probably. That means maybe you ought to think about regulation during bad economic times, during bad labor markets. And then again, if you look at this sort of net job effect stuff, it masks the fact that there's unemployment going on. Even if, in the long run, the level of employment in industry doesn't change very much, you have a lot of unemployment going on. To give you some idea, I think a lot of the focus on the employment impact of regulation should focus on job displacement. And I just happen to like this work. It's also among maybe the most recent work on the cost of unemployment. And what they looked at in this particular study by Davis and Watch is they looked at people who had 3 years of job tenure, what happens when they lose their jobs. Well, during good times, permanently lose about 1.5 years of their earnings. During bad times, it's about 3 years of earnings. Right? That's significant. This is permanent loss. This is not This is not temporary loss. And most of this loss occurs, by the way, after they're reemployed, except they're underemployed in a sense. And the last thing I can repeat is, okay. And then, of course, there's a recessive effects of regulation. So to summarize, I think that regulatory, employment impacted regulation, one, some of the most important parts of the employment effects are the macroeconomic dynamic effects. Those are very hard to estimate, and agencies don't really estimate that for changes. Second, when you look at the long run impact on employment from regulation, the way to look at that is opportunity cost. Is look at a market surplus sort of approach, not job counting. And again, for agencies that dismiss the employment effect because the number of jobs doesn't change very much, they're missing something really badly there. In fact, they're confusing costs and benefits. And then the third is agencies really should look at the cost of unemployment. When you create unemployment, it takes a while for people to get reemployed. It takes longer if it's in bad economic times, and they have a permanent loss of earnings when it's all over.
Thank you very much, Keith. We will turn next to Joe Aldi.
Thank you, Gary. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to present some work that Billy Peiser and I did as a part of this project. The focus is on environmental regulations, and in fact, the motivation is climate change regulations, and in fact, climate change regulations in the power sector, which was not on the table when we first started doing this work, but now it appears to be a little bit more timely. First, let me talk a little bit about some of the factors that can impact jobs, as well as what I will describe as competitiveness impacts. Part of this is, I think, important for us to think about not just are we losing jobs because of regulations, but in a number of industries where they face extensive competition from foreign firms, the relative regulatory burden between domestic and foreign firms may also affect the economic impact borne by U.S., especially U.S. manufacturing firms. When we think about this in the environmental context, there's a number of factors that can influence the effect on, or the impact on jobs and competitiveness, versus the energy intensity or the emissions intensity, which probably isn't that surprising. Certainly when one thinks about energy-intensive manufacturing and the prospect of higher costs of electricity as a result of power sector regulations, the more energy-intensive you are, the greater cost burden you're going to face for a given change in the regulatory state for the power sector. Second is going to be the question of labor associated with pollution control. Keith alluded to some of this about the kind of employment that might arise as firms comply with regulations. It depends in part on the relative labor intensity of your current manufacturing process and what it looks like once you have to pursue a pollution control strategy. The theoretical literature on this, some work that my colleague Billy Peiser did with Dick Morgenstern and colleagues at RFF about a decade ago, work by Berman and Bowie as well, shows that theoretically this is ambiguous, whether or not on net you'd see an increase or decrease in employment from regulation. And third, there's a question when we think about the competitiveness pressures, are in a sense, how footloose is a given industry or firm? How easy is it to relocate to a lower regulatory state or a lower regulatory country if you're facing new regulations here at home? And there's a number of factors that empirically have been found in the literature that have helped to explain why we tend to find relatively modest labor impacts from environmental regulations, even in trade-exposed manufacturing industries. So if you produce a good that has high transportation costs, that's going to make it less likely that you're going to relocate your activity to another country. If you benefit from so-called agglomeration economies, so we can think about some industrial parks where one factory may produce various kinds of goods or materials that are used as inputs in the factory next door. That's also going to reduce the likelihood that you relocate to another jurisdiction. And finally, if a significant share of your capital is in a large fixed physical capital, it becomes really expensive to think about relocating a factory, especially before you've had a chance to fully depreciate that capital. In terms of the empirical literature, some of this, and Keith alluded to this and made a point about the differences when we think about net jobs, but in a sense when one looks at the data, you tend to find relatively, what I would describe as relatively precise zero effects in a number of energy and emission intensive manufacturing industries. that the investment to comply with environmental regulations is resulting in employment of labor that offsets some of the labor loss. I think it's also important to recognize that when we're looking at some of the most pollution-intensive industries in manufacturing, these tend to be much more capital-intensive than labor-intensive. Second, there are a number of factors that affect employment employment as well as domestic production in some of the energy-intensive, trade-exposed industries. So Levinson and Taylor, in a paper in the International Economic Review about 5 years ago, they evaluated the effect of environmental regulations on trade between or among U.S., Canada, and Mexico in emission-intensive manufacturing. And they estimated that probably about 10% of the increase in net imports for the U.S. can be attributed to environmental regulations. So about 90% are to other factors. And I think that's one thing that's important to recognize, that in the grand scheme of things, when one's looking at how regulations play out in the context of international trade, other factors such as differences in tax regimes, labor costs, currency exchange rates, etc., often play a much bigger role than environmental regulation in determining the effects of domestic regulation on employment. Finally, some work from Michael Greenstone, a colleague down at MIT, has found that when we focus on just the U.S., you see, in a sense, more evidence of relocation. In his work looking at detailed data in the manufacturing sector, you had about 500,000 jobs that effectively relocated from non-attainment areas under the Clean Air Act to attainment areas. So moving from those places that had heavier air quality regulatory burden to areas with lower air quality regulatory burden. In a sense, that's not surprising because the kinds of differences that might mute relocation, such as transport costs are certainly lesser where you're operating within the United States. Some of the other barriers to trade certainly don't occur when we're thinking about crossing state lines as opposed to national borders. Now, the thought experiment underlying our work, we decided to look at historically the relationship between idiosyncratic energy price shocks, in particular electricity price shocks, to U.S. manufacturing and their production, net imports, and employment. So the idea is to say, let's look at historically how changes in energy prices affect the operation of manufacturing firms, and use that as a way to sort of simulate the impact of regulations in the power sector that would raise prices that these firms would face in the future. We use fairly detailed data of more than 400 industries over about 20 years to estimate the relationships between electricity prices, employment, production, and net imports. Now, one thing that's important in our analysis is that we recognize that how the firm responds to a change in electricity prices depends in part on how much electricity, how much energy it uses in production. So if you're a very energy lean firm, a very energy lean industry, an increase in electricity prices probably is not going to have a big impact on it. If you produce steel through electric arc furnace technology, you care a lot about the electricity price. If you produce aluminum, you care a lot about the electricity price. These are very large shares of their input costs in the production. But as you can see from this figure, a majority of manufacturing firms in the U.S. have about 2% or less of their costs in energy. So for the vast majority of manufacturing, you're not going to see really a meaningful impact of higher electricity prices on their cost of production. This figure here shows our estimates for the relationship between employment and what we call gross employment before we try to differentiate the employment impact that's associated with competitiveness pressures. The gross employment energy price elasticities. And we allow this to vary with the energy intensity of the industry. So the points up there on the figure are showing the 20th, 40th, 60th, 80th, 90th, 95th percentile of the energy intensity of the distribution of manufacturing firms. And so for about 4/5 of the manufacturing sector, we can't statistically distinguish an impact from zero. It's only when you're among the most energy intensive firms, you're above the 80th percentile in the distribution, can we estimate an effect that's different from zero. And when you get above the 90th percentile, we're looking at an elasticity of about 0.3. So that would suggest then that if you had, say, a 10% increase in electricity prices, those firms at the very high end of the distribution would see an adverse impact on gross employment on the order of about 3%. Now, we use this then to simulate the impact of power sector carbon regulation. We use for our simulation $15 per ton CO2. This had the appeal that it was a number very similar to what was estimated for Waxman-Markey by EPA in 2009, very similar to what EPA estimated for the American Power Act in the Senate in 2010. It's also the starting point for the price for the 2009 Republican-sponsored carbon tax bill here in the House. It yields in a number of analyses by EIA an increase in industrial sector electricity prices of about 8%. We also like this because that's about a 1 standard deviation in our data. So we feel like this is something that our data can actually speak to historically in terms of the variation that manufacturing firms have faced in their electricity prices. So we apply this 8% increase in electricity prices associated with a $15 a ton CO2 price to our estimated relationships, historical relationships, to simulate what we think the impact would be sort of the first year or the startup of a carbon pricing regulation. And so we show impacts for gross employment, but also we have sort of a competitiveness effect. What we describe as sort of the change in production a change in consumption minus the change in production. You can sort of think about this as being net imports. Part of what this shows is that some of the decline in jobs in manufacturing, especially among the most energy-intensive firms, will reflect a focus on increasing net imports, but some of it will reflect the fact that goods in the U.S. or I should say, those who are making goods in the U.S. from these energy-intensive products face the higher prices and consume less of those materials. Now, important to sort of keep in mind, of course, that the vast majority of the manufacturing sector is going to see pretty modest impacts. So just a simple thought experiment. If a majority of industry in the manufacturing sector has energy as less than 2% of their input cost, looking at something in the ballpark of a 10% increase in prices means about a 0.2% increase in the cost of their production. So it's a pretty small cost change in the cost of production, and certainly is swamped by a number of other factors that they face in demand and in competition in their markets. So the net employment elasticity is here. So this is sort of accounting for this net import or competitiveness effect. It's showing a much smaller elasticity that's really on the order of about minus 0.1. So about a third of the effect can be associated with competition from abroad. 2/3 of the effect is from decreased consumption of the goods being produced by these energy-intensive industries here. Now this figure here shows the percent changes for the most energy-intensive trade-exposed industries, starting with chemicals, paper, iron and steel, aluminum, cement, and bulk glass, showing this sort of gross employment effect and then this kind of net effect that we would associate or attribute to competitiveness. On net, we would see an impact of about 10,000 jobs, 10 to 11,000 jobs from the gross employment effect. And about 4,000 jobs when we look at the impact that net imports, if they were not facing comparable regulation, would be displacing in the U.S. economy. So to wrap up, we do see an estimated impact that is statistically significant. I'll leave it up to those who engage in the public policy debate on whether or not you think 4,000 to 11,000 jobs is large or small. In some contexts, I think you could describe these as small. In other contexts, you would think of these as large. When we think about the sort of current state of the economy, I think these numbers are relatively small compared to the number of jobs that we need to create to get back to full employment. But we do estimate these adverse employment effects. I think that they are small, though, when we think about other factors driving economic activity in the manufacturing sector. So when we looked in our data, the average change year to year in production in energy-intensive industries is between 6 and 9%. Varies in those 6 industries that I identified. So we're picking up a production effect that's less than 1%. So year to year, you see big changes in domestic production. A lot of that is reflecting what's going on in aggregate demand in the U.S. It's going on in terms of what kind of competition they're facing by foreign firms. It affects what their prospects are for exporting as well. So there's a number of factors that I think are going on that when we think about the most energy-intensive trade-exposed industries, a number of factors that seem to have a much bigger impact on year-to-year production and hence employment than what the kind of carbon pricing regulation that we looked at in our analysis. Finally, in terms of policy implications, I think there's a couple things that are important. One is to think through how you design smarter regulation. Keith's right. We should be designing smarter regulations. There are smart regulations out there, there are dumb regulations out there. Some of that is a function of discretion by regulatory agencies. Some of it may be a function of the kind of authorities that regulatory agencies are operating. So sometimes they are constrained by how they can design as smart a regulation as possible. Certainly when we think about what's causing the change in employment, whether it's import pressures or not, I think can affect how one might design efforts to try to mitigate the losses to jobs. I think it's also important for us to think about, as we consider the role of assessing jobs in regulatory analyses, we got to think about where do jobs really matter, when are the magnitudes really meaningful, and when are they're not. And I think this is a political decision, but we already do this in other contexts. We do much more extensive regulatory review for those regulations that have pretty big price tags. That's governed under the executive order for benefit cost analysis and RIAs in the executive branch. It's the basis for what determines a major regulation that's triggered under the Congressional Review Act. It might be useful for us to also think about at what point does it merit more extensive analysis of job impacts. What's sort of the threshold number for us to then do more detailed analysis. Perhaps we need some of the macro analysis that Keith talked about. And I think there's useful debate on where we draw that. So I look forward to our conversation at the presentations, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Joe. And now we will turn to Tim Bartek. Just to build on Joe's point about whether 4,000 or 11,000 jobs is big or small number. Roughly, if you look at the BLS data, roughly 1 million Americans lose their job involuntarily every month. And, you know, it was much more than that during the peak of the recession, but that's just a reference point you can make of what you will. Tim?
Thank you, Kerry. One thing I can guarantee you, you're going to hear some very different perspectives this afternoon. So I just had a few minutes. If you want to hear a more formal version of my remarks that will both elaborate on some of the theoretical points I'm making and present empirical evidence, there's this paper, Social Cost of Jobs Lost due to environmental regulations, that's on the Upton Institute website that you can read and provides more backing for what I'm going to say this morning. Okay, I just have 4 points. One, job loss has large social costs. However, they're not as big as the earnings associated with the lost jobs. They're quite a bit less. If you actually look at environmental regulation and you add in the social cost of job loss to the benefit cost analyses, as an empirical matter, this in general does not really alter the benefit cost analysis very much for the overwhelming majority of regulations. Third, the job gains, the indirect job effects of regulations, should also be counted as part of the benefit cost analysis. There are benefits of job gains just as there are costs of job losses. You have to be consistent. Fourth, and this is kind of an extension of this point, if the presence of involuntary unemployment leads to large social cost of job loss, it also leads to social benefits of job creation, which affects, frankly, everything government does, not just regulation. We're talking about regulation this morning. I'm actually a labor economist, a regional economist. I worry about jobs all the time, not just in talking about environmental regulation. So I think you can already see we have some different perspectives, plenty of things to discuss. Okay, first point. Job loss costs are large. It was already referred to, there have been studies of this. The paper I talked about reviews many, many studies, but let me just focus on 3. There is a study of the job loss effects of the Clean Air Act by Reed Walker. That's a very good study. Reed comes up with the conclusion that if you look at what happened to workers displaced by that, and what their subsequent employment experience was, they suffered large social costs due to the Clean Air Act. And if you add up the present value of those social costs over the whole life of the regulation, you end up with a number a little bit under $100,000. Now, this isn't an annual figure. This isn't how much they lose each year. This is the present value of what they lose over the time it takes them to find a new job, etc. So that's a large number. However, I want to point out that that number is, if you just simply took up the job loss numbers in that paper and figured out the present value of the total earnings associated with those lost jobs, that 100,000 number is only about 10% of the earnings with the lost jobs. So simply saying that there are a lot of earnings lost, that's a big overstatement of the lost jobs. The Davis-Von Wachter study has already been referred to. That doesn't look at jobs lost due to environmental regulations. It looks at jobs lost in general. Comes up a little lower number. The present value of the job loss for displaced workers is about $77,000. But again, that's much less than the earnings that you would associate with those lost jobs, 11%. And then I've done a number of studies of local labor markets, and those studies look at when you look at a metropolitan area or other local labor market and look at what are the effects of either job losses or job gains. And you find effects in either direction. Job losses, you lose employment rates, you lose wage rates. They go down. Job gains, employment rates and wage rates go up. I actually come with a little bigger number that the social cost of a job loss is about $134,000. Again, this is a present value over the whole time period. It's a little bit more than the other numbers. It's about 14% of the present value of the earnings associated with lost jobs. Now, why isn't this 100%? It's not 100% because people and markets adjust. Even in the presence of involuntary unemployment, which is a reality, people adjust to job loss, markets adjust to job loss. Job loss is a large number. It's not 100% of the job changes. Now, in this paper, I go through another environmental relations and say, well, okay, what if we added in job loss? So, okay, so EPA, and frankly, not just EPA, all benefit cost analysis traditionally has not included a social value of job loss in benefit cost analysis. It's universal in benefit cost analysis. In this 2013 paper, I looked at a number of environmental regulations, and what I found is that if you include in job loss, typically it adds somewhere between 1% and 12% to the overall cost of the regulation. The average about 5%. It very rarely tips the bottom line because for most of these regulations, EPA's calculations, you can challenge those, but the benefits are many multiples of the cost. So, change it by 10% is not going to really change anything for almost all regulations. You can find exceptions, but almost all. So here's one example. Air toxic pollution regulations for public utilities, a relatively recent regulation. And all these dollar figures in this graph are in billions of dollars. Billions of 2012 dollars, and all are present value figures for the entire life of the regulation. So, a worst case scenario that EPA calculated for this regulation was that it might cost 80,000 jobs. Big number, particularly if you're the Congress representing that district. You multiply that by $134,000 present value per job, you come up with a number of $4 billion. Also a big number. We live in a big economy, okay? $16 trillion economy. We need to get the context. EPA calculates, according to EPA's calculations, the benefits, the present value of the benefits of this regulation are 1.3 trillion to 3.3 trillion over the life of the regulation. Okay? Over 250 times as big. Now, the reason for the variation is different depending on what study you believe. They're looking at how many lives there will be saved by this regulation. We're talking about lives here. People's lives, according to EPA, will be saved by this regulation. That has a value. Jobs have value, lives have a value. They both have to be counted. EPA estimates the social cost of this regulation at the present value is again $354 billion, a big number. But it's a big economy. The benefits, according to EPA, are at least 3 or 4 times the cost. What happens if you add in the $4 billion of social cost due to the lost jobs? It changes the overall cost regulation by 1%. The big issue with this regulation isn't whether we add in the social cost of jobs lost, it's whether or not the benefits are actually 1.3 trillion to 3 trillion. Point 3 is that if we're going to look at the social cost of job loss, we also need to look at are there any job gains that might provide benefits. So the 30,000 job loss is, a worst case scenario. A lot of times when you see people say job loss, they're citing the direct effects on the regulated industries and the spillovers from that. But it needs to be kept in mind that when consumers spend money, it goes somewhere. So if it's not going to direct production jobs and now it's going some to compliance jobs, those are jobs. Someone has them. Someone is employed who otherwise might not be employed. That is a benefit. You can't not count job loss as a cost, and not count job gains as a benefit. You have to be consistent on the other side. And not only that, if consumers choose, as a result of the regulation, to spend money on other goods, other than the regulated good, which now is more expensive, that creates jobs in those industries. Again, there are going to be workers somewhere who will have jobs and will be employed who without the regulation would not have been. We need to count those benefits as well as the cost. Benefit cost analysis has to be consistent. Do they offset? Well, from a point of view, if you benefit cost analysis is this approach where you add up benefits and costs regardless of who they accrue to and ask what is the bottom line. Then once you get the bottom line, then we can debate, okay, who gets the benefits, who gets the cost, there's some redistribution here, this region of the country loses, this region of the country gains, this group gains, this group loses. All of that should be debated. But the initial attempt is to simply add things up, regardless of whom they accrue. Let's see what the bottom line is. It's very hard to actually measure all these job effects in a model. Not easy to do. And as was pointed out earlier, and it's a very challenging task. And the final point is, repeating this and extending this to other policies, we can't just be looking at regulations this way. I mean, this applies to anything the government does. The sequester, the debt ceiling, any kind of policy the U.S. government has, if we think that involuntary unemployment is leading to a situation where we cannot assume that any worker who loses a job will automatically be reemployed, we also can't assume that anyone we hire would automatically have gotten a job anyway, right? We can't assume that. That's not valid. It's not true. So we have to put this in every government policy. And if we're going to start saying that this should be done with environmental regulations, we have to apply it to every job training policy, every kind of employment policy we can think of. But this is what I actually specialize in, employment policies. For example, public service jobs, wage subsidies. Those create job opportunities for people who otherwise would not be employed. And to be honest, in terms of the benefit cost analyses of those policies, including social benefits and social cost of job changes in the analysis, will make much more difference for those policies than it will for environmental regulations. I mean, if we're saying that we need to kill environmental regulations to save jobs, why aren't we saying that the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities put out a thing the other day? There is a new study of a transitional jobs program that was done in a number of states, including Mississippi, transitional job program for long-term unemployed people in Mississippi, California, many other states. The study shows some major benefits from that program in terms of the long-run employability of those folks. This program was killed by the Congress. It was originally authorized. It was killed. It had significant employment benefits from this recent study. So let's not restrict our attention to environmental regulations. Let's extend the debate to everything the government does. And if we're going to be consistent in that way, I'm happy to do that kind of analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all of our panel members. We now will open things up for your questions. I would ask if you would first introduce yourself, state your name and your affiliation. There is a microphone in the back, so I'd ask you to speak nice and loudly, and I will try to rephrase or repeat your question so that we have it on for the benefit of the tape. Okay, question in the front.
I'm Lisa Robinson. I'm a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. I have a question about your point one slide. Those percentages of lost earnings. How are you calculating them? Were those earnings that person would have earned if he or she had stayed in the same job, or were you comparing staying in the same job to some sort of countermeasure?
The calculation is if you took the job, I'm looking at a permanent job change. So a job has lost the economy permanently. We take the earnings of that job and calculate the present value over the future of the earnings associated with the job. One of the things you'll commonly see in, one of the things that led to benefit cost analysis not liking to include jobs is government agencies frequently said, well, we're creating a job. Army Corps of Engineers used to do this. That's going to provide so many earnings over the next 20, 30 years. Voila, we got huge benefits of our dam we're building. Okay, that's not correct. You should not be counting jobs as if the entire stream of earnings is the benefit. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah, no, I guess maybe I should, I think the one thing that I think sometimes gets lost in a little bit in this discussion is that when the agencies are doing these sorts of analysis, they're actually doing two types of analysis. They're doing the cost analysis where they're trying to figure out what the net benefits and costs will be across the population nationally. And then they're also looking at the distribution of those costs and benefits, the gains and losses. And most of these analyses we're talking about are framed as distributional analyses. And so you're really bringing in a different.
So you're trying to actually quantify the welfare effects of unemployment, not necessarily even getting into the distributional analysis.
I think this is some of the tension between what Keith was saying.
I don't disagree with doing distributional analysis. I think, though, if you look at the following issue, are the benefit cost analyses of the EPA biased because they don't include social cost and benefits of job changes? The answer is, well, yes, they're biased, but not by much.
So let me ask another question to all of the panel members. Picking up on one of Keith's points at the outset was that when regulation requires firms to hire more workers, that's actually a cost of regulation. Is it reasonable then to say that when regulation creates job losses, that's a benefit to the employers because it's reduced their labor costs?
Can I make a brief comment on that? Yeah, it's true that when a regulation requires compliance costs, requires the employer to hire folks, That's a cost. That is counted currently as part of the estimate of compliance cost of the regulation. If we think that labor markets are not working perfectly, however, there is a benefit that partly offsets that, which is that some of the folks you hire and the multiplier effects of that would have otherwise not been employed or been employed at lower wage jobs. So I'm not arguing you shouldn't count compliance cost as a cost. Of course, it's a cost. But if you think that labor markets don't work perfectly, then the hiring does produce some benefits. Now, as I'm arguing, it doesn't produce enough that it means that compliance costs associated with hiring are zero, because I think the offsetting benefit we're talking about is maybe 10, 14% of the labor costs associated with the hiring.
Let me just say though, this is just basic microeconomics, right? Using labor resources is a scarce resource, it's a cost. Unless you believe that compliance hiring is pulling people from making other things. Now, it may be worthwhile, you may get the output that you want, but part of the cost is the resources that you use, right? Ideally, you'd want an environmental outcome with as fewer resources used as possible. Part of that is labor resources. Again, unless you think that compliance hiring, they go pull people out of the unemployment line and they're people who are entirely unemployable elsewhere, it's a cost. And the economic cost is the difference between the value of the compliance workers where they'd be otherwise and the value in the industry, right? And then you talk about production workers losing their jobs. Well, they have a value in that industry. When they lose their jobs, it's their secondary use. It's the opportunity cost. What industry would they go to if they find other work? The difference is the economic cost. That's why I'm talking about the sort of the dead weight loss, the market surplus way of measuring it. So it's just looking at the opportunity cost. That's how both of these things are cost, right? You're pulling in resources and pulling them from something else. You're releasing resources and pushing them out to something else, right? Both things are cost, and it's not like job counting. Job counting is just a terrible way to look at this. You have to look at the opportunity cost of these jobs and other uses.
So Kerry, I'll add to this. I mean, I agree with Keith. We look at labor as a cost. It's a cost just like capital, materials, et cetera, in doing business. And so I found it a little perplexing when some people want to do an analysis of the cost of losing a job or the benefits of creating a job, and just bring that into a benefit cost analysis. Sometimes I have a concern when we look at this of whether or not we're going to risk double counting cost, because some of what is showing up on the cost side of the ledger of a regulation, when you see estimates of factories being closed down, is reflecting some of the foregone productivity from the labor there. So the thing is, I think that given the nature of the debate right now, where people want to have an independent assessment of jobs, there's some value in trying to assess that. There's some value in trying to assess, is this a really big number or not that requires an even more detailed analysis? When we actually see benefit cost analysis done in practice and the regulatory impact assessment, there's a number of pieces of information. It's not just at the end of the day, what is the size of my dead weight loss triangle? There's a number of pieces of information that go into the process. And so if we think that in the context of the current labor market in America, that there's an appetite in having an estimate of jobs, I think it's useful in producing that kind of estimate. I think that, in large part, when we look at this, and especially when we think about the context of the potential adverse impacts of long-term unemployment, which I agree with when I look at the literature, the costs do look quite significant. It does raise the question that I think Tim brought up, which is this something that we should be targeting first and foremost in our evaluation of regulatory policy? Or do we think about our other fiscal tools that can be used to try to mitigate the adverse impacts of long-term unemployment and the costs associated with that? So I think it's something where if the policymakers say they want to understand jobs, perhaps with the caveats that Keith laid out, like not all jobs are the same, but say here's an estimate of the jobs and whether or not you think that then merits a follow-on analysis that's much more detailed, perhaps as a full macroeconomic assessment, because most regulatory analyses focus on just the sector in question. In fact, the analysis we did was motivated in part because of some of the discussion in the EPA rule on the cross-state, the EPA RIA and the cross-state air pollution rule, where they say we've estimated the employment impacts in the power sector, but not the indirect impacts that potentially could be meaningful among some of the users of electricity. So that's why we did in part our analysis. I'm not sure at the end of the day we should just come up with one number, one modified measure of benefit cost analysis. I think we just come up with some estimates of jobs and bring that to those who make decisions and say, okay, is this important enough for us to do additional analysis? Because I think at the end of the day, it's really hard for us to do something that we could rigorously defend as a modified benefit cost measure.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Ron Berg. This is for Mr. Parker. I was curious about your remark that I think the words were, if you assume or if you accept that there is imperfection in the labor market, then you were translating that into there could be benefits from the mandatory job creation, from the mandatory employment effect. What would you specify? What is the nature of the market failure in the labor market that's giving rise to this mysterious benefit?
Okay, so just to reiterate, so the question is, what are the imperfections in the labor market? What might they be that would give rise to needing to factor in jobs in this different way?
The imperfection is we have large amounts of involuntary unemployment. As a result, not everyone who wants a job and is qualified for a job can immediately get one that accords with what their skills and abilities are. That's the current, let me finish my answer. That's the current situation in this country and in many local labor markets. As a result, when you look at local labor markets, for example, if a local labor market gains jobs, what we observe, that job gain is associated with significant increases in employment rates in that local labor market. It is also associated with significant increases in job upgrading, where people who otherwise would have obtained lower quality jobs obtain better jobs. And many of those gains are sustained long-term. There are tremendous costs to long-term unemployment. There are gains to reemploying people, and the labor market is such that as you reemploy people, that creates better opportunities for a lot of folks. So the job gains are the kind of job benefits I'm talking about are very concrete. They're higher earnings per capita for workers and potential workers. And what studies have demonstrated is that occurs due to job gains in the local labor market, and of course the converse occurs due to job losses in local labor markets. So you can't argue that job losses are a disaster for the economy and job gains provide no benefits. It's just not consistent.
Do you have a follow-up, or there's another hand? Yeah, right?
Brian, George Washington University. I think one of the sources of confusion that we run into is that sometimes we talk about what's the cost, as Keith does. He's thinking in terms of a social cost, labor is a scarce resource, it has an opportunity cost, we tend to think that way. But sometimes we're talking about costs that fall in particular parts of the firm and individual, someone losing a job. And it's hard to make inferences back and forth between those. And what brought that to mind last week was seeing an article on Mexico where teachers have such a strong form of tenure that they can pass jobs to other family members, they can sell jobs on the market, and the government is trying to remove that right from teachers, and it's very controversial. I think that's a case where you can say, well, yeah, those individuals, if the government takes away their right to sell their job, it's going to be a real economic loss to them. It's going to be a cost to them. And yet, thinking socially, I don't think we agree that that means we're seeing a social cost. And so you have to be careful about what you can go back and forth between those two different meanings of what's the cost.
Okay, so that was more, I guess, a comment than a question, but that there's a different meaning in costs when we're thinking about this from a societal standpoint versus the actual costs that are being incurred by a specific individual.
I just one of the things that I think It comes to my mind, for example, when I see research that looks at a regulated industry and notes that, gee, over time, as this industry became more regulated, the employment level didn't change very much. Right. Now, what that tells me is, gee, in that industry, let's suppose that it created 40,000 compliance jobs at that time period. What that tells me is each one of those 40,000 compliance jobs came at the expense of a production job. It's a one-for-one. You pick the compliance job and it costs a production job, right? So that's, to me, is the real danger of looking at this net job stuff, right? If your level doesn't change. The industry has lower output, higher price. And that's within the industry. Look at the indirect effect. You've got higher prices. You've got a potential job impact in other industries that add on to that.
So it depends on who you are. If you're someone who potentially could get a production job, then obviously the loss in production jobs is a cost. It may mean that your earnings over your lifetime will be lower. On the other hand, if you're someone who potentially is qualified to get a compliance job, as a result of this regulation, your earnings over your lifetime may be higher than they otherwise would be. Now, from a strict benefit cost standpoint, we just add that up and we say, okay, there are costs to some people, benefits to others, we add them up, we can argue over which is greater, which is less, and then, of course, you can then debate the distributional effects of this and argue over, which group do you think has lower income or is more virtuous, or I suppose, since we're in Washington, whose district they live in. But you can't say that the loss of production jobs, well, you can say it, obviously, I don't think it's true. You can obviously say this, I don't think you can say that the loss of production jobs is a social cost, and the gain of compliance jobs has no social benefit. If the labor market has involuntary unemployment, if we're not at full employment, then both changes have social consequences that we must account for.
Again, two economic costs, you don't get the difference between them and say, oh, that's zero, there's no cost. They're both costs, right? And well, I keep going on this, but people who work in compliance are not worthless if they're not working in compliance. They have other jobs they can be doing, and they won't be doing those jobs. That's just the way you look at it. Yes?
I'm Wendy Hoffman with the EPA. Have you ever thought about taking the analysis even further and saying if it's an air regulation, which has benefits of improving air quality, therefore leads to a healthier society, fewer days, less productivity losses from people who are sick and unable to work, that you're actually increasing the pie of the labor force, and you're increasing the productive capacity of the population. So therefore, you're adding more people in rather than just simply taking a worker from one job, putting them in another.
So factoring in, just to reiterate for everyone, the benefits of regulation, particularly say environmental regulation, can have labor effects as well by increasing worker productivity through loss of days of illness and hospital visits and so forth.
I think that's exactly right. That's where you get the benefits down, and then you get the costs down. You got to get the cost right. If you don't have the costs done right, you don't have a fair comparison.
But you don't see that as actually expanding the labor pool. If you're saying one job in one place equals to a loss in a job, a production job, for example, but if people are healthier and you're bringing people back into the labor market, maybe in total.
Yeah, and when you do a cost-benefit analysis, that should be on the benefit ledger, and that should be counted. And it is, but I'm just sort of saying, you also got to get the cost ledger right, right? And the fact that you use up more labor resources is on the cost ledger.
Okay. You have a question back there?
My question's for Mr. Hall. My name is
Introduce yourself. Yeah.
Chris. I'm an intern with Congressman Adam Schiff's office. One of your final slides was showing the cost and salary changes of being unemployed for about 3 years or so in men under 50. My question is twofold. So the first question is, does this measure people who got jobs with very similar skills or within a similar industry, or is it just people who were unemployed and they found some other job 3 years later? And, sorry.
Well, yeah, and to just clarify, that was a study of job loss of high tenured workers. So they're workers who had at least 3 years in the same job. So only look at that pool. And it just looked at their experience of those people over a fairly long period who lost their jobs and compared them to similar people who didn't lose their jobs. And over their lifetime, there was a loss of lifetime earnings discounted of about 3 years worth of their earnings in bad times, about 1.5 years in good times. So really what it's looking at is looking at, in a sense, the economic cost of a skills mismatch because those people lost their work and can't find similar work. And again, this is exactly in the face of that full employment assumption that's used so often, that people just find identical jobs with the same pay and there's no really long-run cost. Well, this is in fact a long-run permanent cost. And by the 3 year, again, that's the sort of the lifetime earnings that's lost. And by the way, that is not a bad way to look at it. In fact, I think the social cost is not less than the earnings, it's much more than the earnings. Right? Because in fact, when people lose their jobs, not only do they have lost earnings, there are all sorts of health effects that have been estimated. There are all sorts of community effects. There are even effects on second generations after people lose their jobs. So in fact, the earnings loss that I just mentioned underestimates the social cost of job displacement from any source. Could be regulation, could be anything.
Okay, we have one more question, and we're going to then allow a wrap-up for any of the panel members, and we'll shift to our second panel.
Right, we've been talking about the accounting, whether you put it on one side or the other. But if you have an adverse employment effect that you've identified, I think, what can you do next? How do you mitigate that other than not regulate?
So I think part of it depends on trying to understand why there's the adverse employment effect. So that's one of the motivations for the work that we did, is trying to see how much of this is a function of trying to assess foreign competitive pressures. I think that's been part when one looks at some of the debate on climate policy. There's discussion on whether or not to use border measures, whether to think about the use of allowances in a way to mitigate the cost borne by energy-intensive industries because of concern about the foreign competitive pressures. So what our analysis shows, that's part of what's going on, but not all of it. But how one might think about that. Now, how that fits within, say, Clean Air Act regulatory authority is very different than how we might think about that in the context of drafting new legislation. Because certainly there's more flexibility in the latter case when one's working under existing authorities at EPA. But I think part of it is really trying to understand what's driving the cause of the job loss. And then the question is it something you need to do through the existing regulatory instrument? Or do you say, well, wait, there are a number of things on the fiscal side the government can do to mitigate? So there are some forms of transition assistance that the government can actually provide. This is one of the things that I find a little odd about this debate, is that we're so focused on the impact of jobs through regulations and talking about the really huge loss, which I think is evident when we're looking at the really long-term unemployed. That there are some significant costs to long-term unemployment. I just don't think the first way to fix that is to modify the regulatory program. I just think is how you think about the fiscal policy. So, there are obviously a range of views on that, but I think there's a number of tools that one can try to tap into to try to mitigate some of these impacts. But it starts with finding out, what are the causes of the job loss, and I think it also matters what's the magnitude. In some sense, if you're talking about losing 500 jobs here, 1,000 jobs there, it may be hard to design a meaningful response policy to deal with that kind of job loss. If you're talking about 25,000 jobs here, 50,000 jobs there, that may be a different story where it makes sense to incur the kinds of effort and resources to get a program up and running to deal with that kind of job loss.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead, we'll just sort of go down the road for any final comments, and you can address this question or anything else.
Good. I got two things with that. One thing that amazes me is these regulatory impact analysis. When they look at the benefit side, they take into account the timing very carefully. The timing of the regulation, when did the benefits occur, et cetera, and they discount it all back and look at that transition very carefully. Then they get to the cost side, they just ignore the transition cost. Right? They're not treating it equally. Their methodology is set up to look at the transition of the benefits, of the effects of regulation. They also could do that with the cost, and that is a real cost for the unemployment. There is a transition cost, and people do take time to find work. And the second thing is not quite answering the question, but it's sort of an interesting contrast for me. A lot of my career has been in international trade, looking at the effects of trade agreements. And for decades, when we do trade agreements, we phase in the trade agreements over time, over 10 years, to sort of try to mitigate the employment effect over time. We have trade adjustment assistance for those workers who lose their jobs because of the trade agreement. So they all have this sort of helping out what's happened to people from the job loss from trade agreements. When we get to regulation, we just ignore it. There are people who lose their jobs, they're real people, and we don't worry about when we're making them unemployed, we don't worry about whether we phase it in, so we try to minimize the transition costs, and we have no adjustment assistance for people who lose their jobs because of regulation. That's an odd mismatch to me.
Thank you.
So I think, for folks who get tired of thinking about two sides of the issue on Capitol Hill, it may be nice that we have three sides of the issue on this panel. I think that at the end of the day, it's not clear to me that the job loss estimates are really that big, especially in the context of other I think, really big macro factors that are driving the employment situation in the U.S. I think that if we care politically, and I think it's evident from the debate, that we do care politically about the job impacts of regulations, we should try to estimate those job impacts. We should then determine whether or not a given number after a preliminary analysis merits a much more sophisticated, detailed analysis, just as we do in general in benefit cost analysis. But it's not clear to me that we have the means to really generate a measure of job loss that you would incorporate into benefit cost analysis to construct a modified measure of welfare change associated with proposed or final regulation. So I think it's something that can still be useful in the political debate because there's an appetite for that information. Just as when one looks at all the kind of information produced for regulations, we produce a benefit cost analysis, there's some distribution analysis for the big rules, there's some analysis on the impacts on states and localities. In the environmental context, there's some environmental justice analysis done on the case. So there's a variety of analyses that are done that are of interest to policymakers and the decision makers. We can present the analysis on jobs as an additional input on that. But it's not clear to me that we're actually in a position where we could incorporate in a rigorous way job loss into the welfare calculation of regulations.
I think the most important thing we need to do is debate how we can adopt policies that will move the entire U.S. economy towards full employment. And in particular, that we renew the debate over what can be done to lower long-term unemployment. That includes every policy the government has. It includes environmental regulation, but it also includes many job creation policies that the government is not currently using due to lack of political will. I think both the left and right need to be consistent on this issue. The left, if people on the left think that unemployment is a high social cost and that measures to reduce unemployment therefore have high social benefits, then people on the left have to also acknowledge that when jobs are lost due to environmental regulation, that is a high social cost. There's a symmetry there. And on the right, if you think that there's this huge social cost of environmental regulation, if that's your position, due to the lost jobs, then you have to acknowledge that there might be benefits to creating jobs. As someone who spent I spent most of my career working on issues of how do you increase employment for everyone in the U.S. economy. I've spent some time in environmental regulation. That's not my main topic of concern. My main concern is what do you do to lower unemployment, increase employment rates, and raise wage rates. I certainly welcome conservatives who acknowledge their high social cost of long-term unemployment, and I await their acceptance, therefore, of the need for vigorous job creation policies, as well as policies to ameliorate potential negative impacts of regulation. Thank you.
I want to thank all the panel members. Please join me. We'll now take a couple of minutes break just to rearrange the table. Please feel free to get up, grab a cookie, get a bottle of water. And then we have a second panel that's going to continue a lot of these questions that have been raised here, focusing on incorporating job losses into regulatory analysis. Jonathan Macer is the Deputy Dean and Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School. He is, in addition to what's in the bio, a co-author with Eric Posner of the 2012 Virginia Law Review article on regulation, unemployment, and cost-benefit analysis, and also with Eric Posner, co-author of a forthcoming chapter in our book, Unemployment and Regulatory Policy. Then Brian Mannix will speak. He's currently president of the Buckland Mills Associate and a visiting scholar at George Washington University, previously serving as the EPA's Associate Administrator for Policy, Economics, and Innovation. He's author of a forthcoming chapter in the book, Employment and Human Welfare, Why Does Benefit Cost Analysis Seem Blind to Job Impacts? Next, Lisa Robinson, who's a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. She is the author in the book of the chapter Toward Best Practices, Assessing the Effects of Regulation on Employment. And finally, Adam Finkel, Senior Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and Executive Director of the Penn Program on Regulation and formerly Head of Health Standards for OSHA. He is co-editor of the book, Does Regulation Kill Jobs? And also the author of the chapter entitled Emitting More Light Than Heat, which we hope we are doing here today. So with that, Jonathan, we'll ask each of our panel members a short amount of time per 10 minutes or so.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Carrie, for organizing. Thank you to those of you who stuck around. Carrie said this is based on joint work with my colleague, Eric Posner. So when I use the word we, it's not the royal we. A lot of what I'm going to say has been covered already in the previous panels. That's nice. I'm going to skip through some of this presentation and just respond to what I thought were a couple of the key points discussed earlier. Okay, so as you all know, cost-benefit analysis has been going on for 30 years, but it's never included the costs or benefits of unemployment, despite the fact that the causal mechanism by which regulation generates employment or unemployment is pretty well known and understood. Now, one thing I want to stress is that this does not mean that agencies have not been calculating unemployment. To the contrary, they've been calculating and recording unemployment numbers for quite a lot of years. But it's never part of cost-benefit analysis. It's something called job loss analysis or sometimes economic analysis. It's separate and distinct from cost-benefit analysis. And the numbers from unemployment, from these unemployment numbers from the economic analysis are just never incorporated into the cost-benefit analysis. So, in Eric and my work, when we use unemployment figures, we're using the agency's own unemployment figures that these agencies have generated themselves as part of their studies. So in the course of this, of course, regulations are sometimes rejected by the agencies on the basis of projected lost jobs. So when they don't reject an entire regulation, they sometimes reject some regulatory options. The problem is that these decisions are arbitrary and unprincipled to a very large degree. The agencies are just sort of eyeballing the numbers and discarding the ones that they think are too high. That will cause too many lost jobs. But it's impossible to know exactly how many lost jobs or whatever. It's too many in any given context. So Tim Barczyk in the previous panel talked about a regulation that would cause 30,000 lost jobs or thereabouts, but lead to trillions upon trillions of dollars of benefits. In a vacuum, 30,000 lost jobs may seem like a lot. In the context of such a valuable regulation, it seems like very little. So this, for instance, is the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration's analysis of the job impacts of its 2009 corporate average fuel economy regulation. It sort of tells you that NHTSA considered 6 different regulatory options. It calculated the lost jobs for each option, and then it just sort of said, well, some of these would be acceptable and some of these would not. And the problem is that it's impossible to know what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in a massive economy without knowing what's on the other side of the ledger, without knowing what the benefits are that we're balancing against. So 55,740 lost jobs feels like a lot, but if you're getting $2 trillion in benefits on the other side, maybe it's not so much after all. And this is why we say that we need to incorporate these unemployment numbers into cost-benefit analysis, because we think that just as it might be that we're, in some cases, over-regulating, having not considered the lost jobs. In other cases, it might be that agencies are under-regulating because they're scared off by what seem like large job loss numbers in the presence of regulations that might otherwise create lots of benefits. Okay, so one question that other panels have already talked about is, that I want to take up, is whether unemployment is actually costly. So when a worker is laid off, there are a number of different costs, including the loss in wages while the worker is unemployed, transition and job search costs, that worker has to go out and try to find another job, psychic and hedonic costs. These are sort of sometimes thought as softer costs than the others, but I don't want to minimize them that way. Unemployment and sort of income instability and uncertainty that goes with it can be extremely stressful and psychically very harmful to people, and those costs can be measured and quantified as well. And then, of course, after being rehired, there's a possible lower wage. And I want to focus on this last category because it's the one that the economists make the most hay out of. So why are wages lower? So if somebody is laid off and then they go and earn lower wages at their new job, there are at least two possible explanations as to why that is. The first explanation is that the previous employment was just at above market wages. That person was earning too much and they got laid off in part because they were earning too much. If this is true, then the wage reduction is not really a social cost. It really shouldn't be part of any cost-benefit analysis. It's just a redistribution of surplus. The employee who was getting paid too much is giving something back to the employer. And you can imagine a poor employee who is earning a normally large salary, they get fired, they're replaced by someone who earns a more modest salary, they go make less in their next job because they're just not that good. That's not a true social cost. On the other hand, there can be a loss of firm or industry-specific human capital, which is to say productivity. You might have a very skilled worker who's very good at building something and loses that job, and then goes and takes another job where they're not building that same thing, and so all of the human capital that they've acquired, all of their productivity gains, are for naught. And when unemployment results in the loss of, oops, these slides are not quite as long as I hoped. When unemployment results in the loss of productivity, that's a true social cost. So if you imagine a skilled factory worker who goes off and takes a job at McDonald's, that person, when they get lower wages at their new job flipping burgers instead of building whatever they were building in the factory, that's a true social loss. That's a loss of real productivity. Okay, so let's talk about the cost of unemployment for a moment. So the best estimate that we found, based on a paper by Von Wagner, whose name we've seen a lot, and Song in Manchester from 2009, is that workers who are laid off lose between $110,000 and $140,000 in wages over the subsequent 20 years after becoming unemployed. And we think that this is a true social cost because, so far as we can tell from these studies, these figures represent real losses in productivity, losses in human capital. Somebody who's good at building something or doing some job is now doing a job that they are much less suited for that generates less value. In addition to that, we would add non-pecuniary losses. Being unemployed leads to a greater risk of death and disease because it's so stressful, it uproots someone's life. It leads to greater sort of losses in hedonic costs, psychic costs, as I was discussing, subjective well-being. So you can add all these numbers up, you get a very large number. For the purposes of our research, we conservatively assume that the cost of a lost job in present value terms is just $100,000. We think that's less than the sort of median estimate of just the wages itself. So we think that's really a pretty conservative estimate, all things considered, and we'll use that $100,000 figure in just a second. Okay. Now the next question is whether cost-benefit analysis misses these costs. And there were some suggestions that we have to worry about double counting, that in fact cost-benefit analysis might already be taking into account these unemployment costs. So this is a very stylized sort of hypothetical example, which also probably won't show up on this slide. So I'm going to sort of race through it. So think about a firm that produces automobiles, and then let's say that it enacts some sort of safety regulation that raises the cost of those automobiles. Okay, so you might imagine that before the regulation, the automobile costs 80. The firm is making 100 of them, selling each at 100. It has 100 employees to make 100 cars, and making 2,000 in profits. After the regulation, the costs go up by 5. The firm raises the price by 5, but now it can only sell 80 automobiles because the price has gone up. And so it lays off 80 of its workers, still making the same amount per automobile, but the overall firm profits have gone down. So the regulation is taking a bite out of the firm, it's taking a bite out of the consumers as well. And let's say in the first sort of row of this note, the costs of making the car, 50 bit are the wages for these employees, 35 are the materials. And let's suppose that each laid off worker who loses his or her job in the automobile industry goes out and finds a job somewhere else in an industry for which they're less well suited, they've lost their human capital that they built up, and they're only making 30 in the new job. Okay, so what are the costs and benefits of all of this? Well, there's a 400 decrease in consumer surplus. That is to say, 80 people are buying these cars and paying 5 more per car. There's a 400 decrease in profits for the firm. So when an agency is going about measuring compliance costs, there are a couple of different ways of doing this. It's sort of unclear exactly, but probably it's going to come up with a number for compliance costs somewhere in the vicinity of 400 or 800 or so. But there are also these 20 cases of unemployment, and those cases of unemployment represent 20 in lost wages per employee. So in other words, 400 in unemployment cost total for a total loss on all sides of producer and consumer surplus, which is to say a total loss of welfare of 1,200. Where does the extra money come from? The extra money is these employees who were sharing some of the surplus. Every time that firm built a car, the consumers got something, the firm got something in profits, and the employees got something as well. And the employees are losing that money. The firm doesn't internalize that. They don't care if their employees go off to some other lesser job somewhere. And so that's not going to be part of the compliance cost. And that's why we think cost-benefit analysis has been missing this. Okay, so that's the hypothetical. Here's the real regulation. So this is an EPA regulation of pulp and paper manufacturers from 1998. I should say we picked this regulation almost at random. It was a regulation we knew well. We've written about it for other reasons, and it has a very nice and clean cost-benefit analysis. So here are the median costs, median benefits, and the benefits net of costs in millions of dollars. It's on this basis that the agency chose to regulate. It looked at this and it said, look, greater benefits than costs, regulation is worthwhile. Here's the number of lost jobs that will result as a consequence of this regulation. These are EPA's own numbers. EPA calculated that many jobs would be lost. And if we assign a value of $100,000 to each of those jobs, all of a sudden what looked like substantially positive net benefits becomes substantially negative net costs. So this is just one example, and other people in the previous panel presented some very good examples of regulations where you're not going to really change the bottom line by adding in unemployment costs. I would just again mention a very good study by Reed Walker about the Clean Air Act, which he shows that the benefits of the Clean Air Act just dwarf any costs, even when unemployment costs are included. But this is to show that there are some regulations where it might actually make a difference. Okay, few concluding thoughts since we're running out of time. So of course, this topic and the research that I did with Eric Posner has become controversial, sort of as viewed through the lens of job-killing regulation, which I guess is in the title of this edited volume that's coming out as well. We're not naive about this. We know how things go, but we don't think that these sorts of issues have any particular political valence. Regulation might create jobs, regulation might cost jobs, there might be some regulations that are so beneficial that it's irrelevant how many jobs are lost or created. We just want to get the numbers right. And we want to get the numbers right here and everywhere else. So we think that it makes sense to use the same sort of analysis when we're looking at large fiscal policy measures, macroeconomic effects, and everything else. But that's not to say that we should ignore it when it comes to regulation, especially when that regulation does have job impacts that are meaningful. It's also worth noting, some people have sort of said, why look here? This is only one effect that cost-benefit analysis might be overlooking. There are lots of other micro and macro effects that CBA is potentially ignoring. And as I said, sometimes this might be a small effect compared with the Clean Air Act, but if we can measure these effects and we can calculate them and they have the potential to make a difference, then we don't see any reason to ignore them any further.
Thank you very much. Brian? Yes. You switch the slides?
I'm going to try to be brief and do that by making only one point, but it's one that's often lost in the shuffle, and it's a difficult one to wrap your head around. And it's really a response to some of the things Jonathan was saying. Is there more beyond compliance costs? I phrased it that way because early on the project, the title of the whole project was Beyond Compliance Costs. It was based on the observation that a benefit cost analysis of regulation typically looks in detail at compliance costs, but doesn't look much beyond that. And there are other things you notice as a consequence of regulation, including effects on workers, and isn't it worth examining those and concluding them? So I want to enthusiastically support the idea that regulation imposes serious costs on workers, as well as on consumers and investors. But at the same time, explain why it's not possible to do what Jonathan asked in the benefit cost framework, to simply add those costs to the business compliance costs without running into a double counting problem. So let's take an illustration of how a hypothetical benefit cost analysis is constructed. benefits on the right, costs on the left. This is a scrubber mandate. It's a hypothetical one in the unnamed industry. It's ordered to install about $1 billion worth of scrubbers. What are the benefits of that? Well, at the firm level, you're expecting to see reduced emissions. But that's not a welfare change. Remember, benefit cost analysis is a summary of all the welfare changes that people experience as a result of this decision. And reduced emissions is not a welfare change. So you have to get somebody like that in a smart risk assessor to work the atmospheric chemistry, the exposure pathways, the injury mechanisms, and figure out what are the consequences for people. And then you have to have an economic model of how to put a value on that. And at the personal level, figure out how many people are affected and how are they affected and what value do they place on that. It's going to affect their welfare, and I define that broadly to include health and to include life expectancy for the exposed population. And so that's what we're looking on. I just sort it up in red, the increases in welfare among people. Now on the cost side, we do something similar. At the firm level, we know that the immediate impact is compliance cost. Firms have to buy the scrubber. But that really doesn't count as a welfare change. We have to think through, well, what does that mean? No individual or family has ever bought a scrubber. It certainly has never been required to buy one by regulation. I'm willing to bet that that's not going to happen anytime soon. Scrubbers are bought by corporations, and corporations are artificial persons. They don't have welfare. And so changes in corporate wealth do not enter into a benefit cost analysis. So the compliance costs really don't belong in a benefit cost analysis as such, even though we see them there all the time. But we do know that people will be affected by these costs, and this happens through the intermediation of markets. Capital markets, labor markets, and markets for final goods and services. So, I mean, reading down the left side of that slide, it's very much like Jonathan's first slide. I mean, markets cost to be passed through. I mentioned in the second bullet on the left side that in addition to reduced output and plant closures and profit losses and wage losses and job losses, you also see gains in all those categories. And some audiences might be surprised that just looking at the cost of regulation, regulatory mandate, that I might be talking about gains, but one Capitol Hill. And I know you know about that. The regulatory mandates often produce winners and losers, even when you're not looking at benefits. You're only looking at the cost side. And both sides come in to talk to you on Capitol Hill, so you know they're there. But we also know that the losses outweigh the gains. To convince yourself of that, just think about, well, what if these scrubbers didn't work? What if they didn't clean the air? And we mandated them anyway. You know that can't be improving social welfare. It's got to be a net loss. And so when we're looking at the cost side, there may be winners and losers, there may be transfers, but you know that on net it's a loss. And it's a loss that eventually, in the third bullet, hits people, and it causes their welfare to decline. And again, that includes health and life expectancy. There's a well-known connection between the health wealth effect will cause people to just lose income, and whether because they've lost a job or because their 401k has decreased in value, that will affect their health and their life expectancy. And that's for consumers and property owners and workers. And I'm defining property owners very broadly here to include homeowners, yes, and small business owners, but also people who own stock in larger corporations, people who just have a 401k that may be invested in a mutual fund that holds equities, or even somebody just holding an insurance policy that's affected by returns on the market. So all of those people are affected by the way costs get passed through in the market. But here's the thing, economists can't go through that left-hand column. It's not possible to go from compliance costs of a regulation down to the final incidence of those compliance costs, and all the people who might be affected. Adam might say it's because risk assessors look smarter than economists, but I would say it's really that it's a much harder problem. The economy is much more interconnected. The ripples travel much farther. You have to count everything, not just the big and immediate effects, but also the distant and small effects that are very hard to see. And so we can't go through, as economists, we can't go through and calculate the final incidence of costs. But we have a shortcut. We can say they're expected to be in a market that's generally competitive and where transactions are voluntary. the expected loss in welfare is equal to the compliance cost on the top line. Now, that's a very powerful assumption. It's not a perfect assumption, but I think it's closer to the net welfare effect of those compliance costs than you could get by trying to say, well, we're not going to count the compliance costs because they fall on firms. We're going to work it through and find all the people who are affected by the changes in prices, the higher electricity prices, higher prices for gasoline, figure out how it affects their lives and their welfare, and add all that up, and that's the true social welfare cost. I think any attempt to do that would be doomed to failure. And by far the best estimate, the most unbiased estimate we can get of the total social cost is to stick with the compliance cost. And you can't add those other categories downstream or upstream without running into the double counting problem. So keep in mind, the only thing that counts in benefit cost analysis is welfare changes. Both benefits and costs represent welfare gains and losses experienced by real people, not by corporations. Compliance costs are not themselves welfare changes, and they don't count because they're welfare changes. On the other hand, some people have a tendency to dismiss them as well. It's just a cost of doing business, and they somehow disappear into the economy. That's not true either. Compliance costs they don't get absorbed, they don't get written off, they actually eventually fall on people somewhere. We don't know where, we don't know who, but it affects their welfare and causes the same kinds of losses in welfare, health, and life expectancy that you see on the benefit side. So compliance costs are a proxy for a whole range of costs whose final incidence we can't figure out. But we do want to know the total, and that's the best estimate we can get. I've got 2 minutes left, so I'll stop there.
So, when Carrie first asked me to write this chapter, I was more than a little bit intimidated because I get 2 in the morning. This could be dangerous. Stereo. You can hear me, right? I was a little bit intimidated because usually efforts to develop best practices are very large debates among lots of different experts around exactly the issues we're talking about today. So I titled this chapter Towards Best Practices, thinking that instead I would talk about some sort of starting points for thinking about how to do these analyses, not expecting to resolve everything else we've been talking about. The chapter actually starts with a discussion of some of the distinctions that people are raising today about the difference between benefit cost analysis and what's often called economic impact analysis, but it's really looking at how the costs and benefits are distributed. And also talking about how we define cost and benefits, because we are definitely not as consistent as Brian's very nice chart would suggest in terms of what goes on which side of the ledger. I then talk about 9 principles, because I only have 10 minutes. I've substantially simplified them for today. These are the 9. They really fall into 2 categories. One has to do with what I think of as scoping and screening, just sort of trying to define the boundaries of the analysis and figuring out what the most important things are to focus on, because of course we always have constrained time and resources and need to figure out what the most important analyses are to do. And then the second set are just things to think about as we're working our way through the analysis itself. The item that's in parentheses was listed as one that I'm not going to talk about today because I think it's sort of a no-brainer, but it's something that we often forget, that if we are going to change the policy in order to alleviate adverse effects on employment, we need to assess the costs and benefits of that change too. It may have effects other than alleviating unemployment that are important. So a lot of these are going to feel like no-brainers, but one of the reasons why I took the time to write them down is that as I was listening to the debate, it seemed to me a lot of people were forgetting about some of these things. This first one is assess important impacts. I don't think there's anybody in the room who would suggest that we should do otherwise. But I do think what we forget about is that the reason we do regulatory analysis is to inform the policy debate. I hear a lot of people say, well, we should only be assessing the things that are large, in some sense, think it's big numbers. But if we've got people arguing about the impact of regulations on employment, we need to assess employment even if we think the results are going to show that employment impacts are negligible, because we need to provide some evidence to feed into the debate. So I think that it's very important to think about what impacts people care about as well as their size. The second is to tailor the analysis to information needs. I think that one step that I found people often skip in doing regulatory analysis is doing screening analysis. They just sort of dive straight into whatever they have data on or whatever sort of strikes them as most important. But in the work that I've done, I've found that if you just take some very extreme assumptions and look at what the effects might be, you can fairly easily start sorting out what issues are worthy of more investigation. And I do think that in some of these cases, simple screening would suggest that employment impacts are unimportant, and you can use the results of the screening analysis to support that conclusion. There will be other cases, like Jonathan was saying, where your screening analysis will suggest that those impacts are important and you do need to do more work. Those of us who do this type of work often talk about applying an informal benefit cost test or value of information test to the analysis itself to help us think about whether it's really worth looking at different impact. This debate over employment and regulation to me seems to be forgetting one very important point, which is that a lot of time lapses between when we start thinking about writing regulation and when that regulation actually becomes effective. So what we need to do is we need to predict what the world will look like in the future absent the regulation and what it will look like with the regulation. And the implicit assumption seems to be, in a lot of this debate, that we will have continuing levels of very high unemployment. I don't know if that's true. I suspect that even the labor economists in the room would have trouble predicting, and certainly hoping that it won't be true. But I do think that it means that when we're doing regulatory analysis, we need to think about what the employment impact, what the employment situation may be like further down the road, and perhaps look at two baselines. One that's a full employment baseline and one that has continuing employment. And we also need to keep in mind that there are a lot of regulations, although these are national regulations, have predominantly impact certain regions of the country or certain industries, and the employment conditions in those areas might be quite different from the natural situation. This one I don't want to spend any time on. I think we've talked about it quite a bit, that regulations lead to both job creation and job loss, and that the time and duration matter, and we also care about changes in wages even for those who remain employed, as well as the quality of employment and the nature of the job. Someone brought this point up earlier, that the benefit side of the equation can also affect employment, and I want to note two things. One is that the measures that we use to value benefits should take into account how the individual who's affected values the effect on their own productivity. So in terms of valuation, that's counted. But when we're doing our separate head counts of job gains and losses and something that's separate from the benefit cost analysis, the effect of health and longevity on employment is, I think, very ambiguous, because if we're in better health, we can work harder, we'll miss fewer days of jobs, or we'll survive for a longer time period, so we can keep working for longer, and we'll enjoy life more. But if our increased productivity allows us to earn more, but also enjoy leisure activities more, we may decide to work less. If we're more productive, our employers may decide that they don't need as many of us. But if we're earning more, we might buy more things. I think it's the outcome of all these factors is very ambiguous. We don't really know much about what's happening on that side of the equation, and it'd be interesting to know more. This point is another one that others have talked about extensively, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. I just want to point out that in the context of looking at individual regulation, if you want to assess the sorts of impacts that Jonathan and others have talked about, that doing the analysis on an individual regulation basis is extremely difficult. All of these studies that everybody's citing are not for individual regulations. They are looking at clusters of regulations, or all the regulations under the Clean Air Act, which is a huge number of regulations, or they're looking at all the regulations that affect a particular industry, which again is a huge number of regulations. This task of estimating the number of jobs that are gained and lost from individual regulation is an immense one that we don't do very well, or can't do very well without more research. And then we have this problem that's been discussed substantially about the dollar value. This is another one that I think is a no-brainer and has been mentioned now several times, but we often forget about the 1,000 jobs can seem big if you don't put it in context, but it might be actually quite small compared to other impacts. It also could be quite large. We really need to put these numbers in context. The other thing is that those of us who do regulatory analysis realize that decision makers are not just interested in the numbers. They want to know the types of jobs that are affected, it's low-skilled jobs, high-skilled jobs, and they want to know the characteristics of the individuals. In particular, are these job losses particularly affecting poor people or people who are otherwise disadvantaged? And then finally, all of these studies that people have been citing about the effects of regulation on employment are retrospective analyses. They're looking backwards at what's happened in the context of individual regulations. And one thing that was startling to me is how few of these they are. We really know very little about this topic and need a lot more studies. And one way of making sure that at least maybe 10 years from now we'll have more studies is to, when we're designing regulations, make sure that we've got something in their design that allows us to do better analysis, whether it's requiring collection of certain types of data or looking for opportunities for natural or quasi-experiments where the regulation has differential impacts in different geographic areas or industries so we can do some sort of comparison. And I think that's it. This is the way the recommendations are actually go.
Thank you very much. And finally, Adam Finkel.
Well, thank you. I'm not being provocative just because it's the end of the day. That's how I always am. As the second author, I get to put the cover of the book on the perspective cover. You'll see in a couple of months. So I want to, for those of you who, I'm sort of the odd person on both panels because I'm actually a practicing public health scientist, a risk assessor, but I've worked in around economics for a long time. So I'm going to sort of take a step back and look at both sides of the ledger, but try and draw parallels between what the improvements on the risk, that is the benefit side of the ledger, and what could be drawn from that to improve the cost side of the ledger. So I'm a strong supporter of cost benefit. I think I come out in between where Jonathan and Brian are on this panel. I think it is really important to try hard to do it better. And while I agree with Brian that there are some insurmountable difficulties, I'm sort of the let's keep trying, even if we fail. Looking at Paul now, we were in probably this room or other rooms 20 years ago talking about smart regulation. That was the mantra of the 90s. People who were perhaps interested in deregulation talked about smart regulation as an alternative. There was a lot of poignant stories told about bicycle helmets and immunization and ways to save lives better than we were saving them through the environment. Frankly, I see some of that going on, just redux here 20 years later, that all of a sudden it's all about the poignant stories of workers. And I'm not sure how sincere that is. I think if you really want to show concern for workers, there's a direct way. Tim Barr talked about unemployment compensation and retraining. I worked at OSHA. I would say that the more direct impacts on workers are when they are killed and injured and caused to have chronic disease in mass droves. That's unemployment's important. I've been unemployed. It's a terrible thing, but life and limb are important too. On the other hand, going right back to what Brian said, I think that I guess I do strongly agree with him, and I'll paraphrase that compliance cost is a proxy, but if you're going to trace it down to the final effects, then you have to make sure that you throw out the compliance cost number before you start that, because otherwise you're double counting. And I think I disagree with Jonathan's example, except for one point. And that's where I sort of come out maybe in the middle here. I don't see how compliance cost. I agree that it's the compliance cost that impels the unemployment, and so it's a kind of double counting to count both the burden that causes the unemployment and then the effect of that burden, which is unemployment, on wages. But I'm not sure I can see how compliance cost can sort of magically take into account the non-pecuniary impacts of unemployment on people. So the depression, the stress, the suicide, the effect on family relationships, the second generation, I do think those are real costs that are non-pecuniary, and we ought to try harder to count that in the benefit cost analysis. I think of all the quotes about this, this one from Cass Sunstein is, I think, good to keep in mind that on the one hand, that the job killing regulation, the chart that Carrie showed of the real takeoff in that phrase, to say it's a redundancy that they always go together is as ridiculous as to say that they always have to compete with each other, that there's no such thing as a job killing regulation. Those are the extremes. We've really talked about this, that sometimes when we say impacts, we mean only one side of the ledger, net job, total jobs lost, which I think is critical and shouldn't be done. Sometimes we talk about net jobs lost or gained, but then we also talk about the individual welfare toll, and I think what we're really trying to talk about is the product of those two things, the social cost of some net number of jobs gained or lost, multiplied by or integrated over the harm to real people by those changes. I don't have time for this, but as others have talked about, it's hard to estimate the net change in the jobs number, and it's hard, I thought if Brian had more time, he probably would have talked more about the different ways to conceptually look at what has happened to the individual person when they move from a place of employment to temporary unemployment. It's not the total wage loss, because that person has, just like when I used to love Nabisco Team cereal, they've taken it away from me. It's not on the market anymore. So I lose the benefit of Team Flakes, but I do have money in my pocket that I wouldn't have had if I bought the Team Flakes. A worker who is unemployed is losing a lot, but that person's also gaining the opportunity to look for other work. It's the reservation wage, which is in between zero and the wage rate, I think is a better starting measure of what's happened to that person than the wage rate. I think I want to talk a little bit, though, in more detail. Why is it so hard to do this before I say that we still should press on and try to do it better? Lisa's talked about a little bit of this, that to the extent that the unemployment rate at a snapshot in time is a determinant of the amount of the social toll on each instance of unemployment, boy, that's hard. It's hard to do for last week. So imagine trying to do it for the lifetime of a regulation, which typically is proposed and then is fought over and then is promulgated and then comes into effect later and then stays in effect for years or decades. If we think we can integrate over a time series of what's going to happen based on changes in employment over a long period of time, boy, that's difficult to do. Signal and noise. I just used Kodak. There was a Krugman column about Kodak that mentioned a couple months ago, which I couldn't find again. But I think Tim Barter was talking about this earlier, that if we're going to look with a microscope, we should also step back and look at the same effects that are happening through the market and through all kinds of other social and other policy instruments. So when I was at OSHA, we regulated a solvent that a lot of people use, but Kodak used it a lot too, and we may have compromised some jobs at Kodak. But the invention of the digital camera had a big deal to do with what was happening at Kodak at around the same time. We haven't talked much about, this is really beginning to get into the differences between what I do on the risk side and what others primarily do on the cost side. And I do agree with Brian. It's not a matter of who's smarter or less smart or less good at what they do, but the inherent difficulty of doing the work. And what I do is, and my colleagues do, is look at sort of physical, chemical, biochemical laws. They are difficult to tease out, but they're not inscrutable, and they're not messing with you as you look at them. So unlike the behavior of molecules in the environment or mutagens in the bloodstream, it's hard to manage to model the behavior of human actors in a dynamic environment. So faced with a given amount of compliance costs, will they tighten the belt, reduce output, lay off workers? Then there's the Washington Monument Syndrome. You folks on the Hill know all about this. All of a sudden, the thing that the agency least wants to cut becomes the most important thing. It's the Washington Monument. If we have a sequester, the first thing that suffers is we can't open the monument for tourism. Well, that happens in the industrial world all the time. When I was a regulator, always when we tried to regulate one thing, the worst possible substitute became the only thing that could be done. if you don't buy this magazine, you'll kill this dog way of doing game theory in regulatory dynamics. So very difficult to model into the future. Are all of these projected layoffs really capricious intent or the prediction of capricious intent? Must you lay these people off, or are there other ways to absorb the compliance costs? If I could wrap up, I'll try to do it in 2 minutes or less. I think we've heard a lot in not quite so direct terms about the broken window fallacy. There's certainly a lot of that, thank you, in the book. I guess I would like to say that if it's true that government intervention that would be breaking windows, or to use Mr. Hall's analogy, giving spoons to construction workers, if you can't create jobs by doing that, but what you're rather doing is employing people to fix windows when they were already doing productive work, I agree with that. But to the exact same extent, I think that if government or industry invents an unbreakable window, that's not a job killer. That is giving opportunities for other people, whether they're unemployed, underemployed, or differently employed, to find new and different work. So I think I've heard sort of echoes of the presidential campaign today. I sort of heard corporations are not people, my friend. I sort of heard I like to fire people. And I do think that we ought to be even-handed, look at job losses and job gains. And the real heart of the chapter, which I guess I'll just say by the book, that I get to be that, is that we risk assessors have worked very hard over many decades to try and analyze thoroughly, humbly, transparently, all these good adjectives. We haven't always succeeded, but the chapter is really based around this chart, which suggests that there are some challenges that we on the science side have met and to some extent overcome, and they're waiting to be met and overcome by economists.
They shall overcome. All right. So let us open it up
I'll take a
for
question about the regulatory moratorium if you want.
some questions. Paul,
I guess
introduce
a
yourself.
comment followed by a question. Paul.
Yeah.
So the comment is that Ryan, who I know very well, dear friend, has made a more elaborate sort of try to defense of the status quo than I've heard in the past, but I still find a logical flaw in it, which is that he's skipping over the very quickly the assumption of a perfect economy and full employment is allowing him to get to the point where he can throw up his hands and say, look, compliance cost is close enough measure. And so and I didn't hear a very clear explanation of why it's double counting. So I guess I now want to ask a question to Jonathan as to whether you think compliance costs can really capture these employment effects, and whether, in other words, are you double counting? I think I heard Adam right. He might say, well, I think you're partly not double counting because the health effects on workers isn't captured by compliance costs, but what about the other aspects?
I mean, I think the answer is no, that you're not double counting. But I think this, so a lot of what Brian said, I agree with. Compliance costs are an input to then the eventual sort of process that generates welfare outcomes for people. And compliance costs are a proxy for a lot of costs and benefits. But by looking at compliance costs, the regulator is not going to see what's going to happen to the workers, because they're not asking these workers, right? You're not looking at what happens if somebody gets laid off and that person goes and finds another job somewhere else, making less money, and whatever else happens to them in the interim. The compliance costs that you'll measure, the regulators are measuring when they conduct these analyses, are losses to consumer welfare. People are paying higher prices for things, and losses to the firm. Firms are making less money, but there's a third party to all of those transactions, the workers, and they're capturing some piece of the pie as well. And if a worker is laid off and they lose their little portion of the surplus, then that's a loss as well. And the compliance cost is not getting at that, because they're only asking the firm, how much is it costing you to comply with this regulation? How much is it costing you in terms of your profit loss? When the worker leaves, if the firm lays off the worker and the worker walks away, that may have some impact on the firm's bottom line, which the firm will report, but the firm never knows what happens to the worker after that point. That's why the number is not being included.
Brian, you have
Yeah, I guess
that question too.
I think what Adam called the non-pecuniary cost to workers, the psychological effects, the suicides, the family effects, those are not externalities. Workers know why they get jobs. They know, what the psychological benefits are, as well as all the other benefits of having a job. And that's why they work. And I think it's implausible to think that an analyst in Washington is going to be able to figure out all those psychological effects on a worker who loses his job and know them better than the worker knows himself or herself, what the effects are. I mean, how could the worker be ignorant of all those things and somebody sitting in an EPA office is able to calculate it? It affects workers' behavior. It affects their reservation price it gets monetized because it affects the reservation price when they look for a job, when they get a job. And it also affects the process of letting people go. I mean, firms just don't go pop. There's often a negotiation involved to ask for concessions, wage concessions from their staff, saying regulation is making it tough, competition from abroad is making it tough. In order to survive, we need to cut wages. They'll offer early retirement. Some people will take it and some people won't. Some people will think it's a good deal and some people will think it's not. But all those things are reflected in the way the firm and the workers behave, the way they negotiate the outcome of hiring and firing. And that's how the market works. And to think that, you can sit in an office in Washington and do a better job of constructing all those effects is just implausible to me. Yes, it's assuming that the market is working. And, people say, well, there's no such thing as a perfect market. Well, that's true. But there's no such thing as a perfect wheel either. Think of all the miles we've traveled since the first, no perfect circle, but since the first rough wheel was cut, we've come a long distance. And the assumption that markets work pretty well in a country like the United States is a powerful assumption, and I think the best assumption to make when doing benefit cost analysis. If you abandon it, you're creating a much more difficult problem that I think will give you a worse answer, even in an economy that is visibly out of equilibrium. I think it's important to work on unemployment, to look at the macroeconomic factors and other factors that help bring the economy to full employment. But I think expecting to do that in the context of benefit cost analysis of individual regulation is not a practical suggestion.
I just want to add to that. I'm still not sure, but I thought that was a cogent explanation of how even the psychological effects might be counted in the compliance cost. I just think it's important to underscore the difference from where I'm coming from with what I heard in the first panel. I just think I guess I agree with Tim Barty. It's very bizarre to me to assert that whether it's a policy or a market-driven outcome in which 10 workers switch jobs is somehow 20 times as bad as no change at all, where you're counting both hiring and firing as cost. That really is looking less to me. I think we have to look at job losses and gains or neither.
I think this is obviously an incredibly complicated and difficult issue, but this is definitely the sort of thing that makes me feel like we need the sort of standard expert process for coming up with best practices, because I don't think it's something that we all can easily resolve. I do think, though, that this is going to be a gross oversimplification just to try to get through it quickly, but there is a very different, the employer has a very different perspective on the value of an employee than what the employee actually the value that the employee actually places on his work. I mean, from the perspective of the employer, even if we assume that the value that the employer is getting paid the marginal value of his or her productivity, from the perspective of the employer, that includes things like taxes, overhead benefits. From the perspective from the employee, it may just be their dollar earnings. And all of these non-pecuniary costs, I think, are real. We do value them in other contexts. The value for statistical life that we use for valuing benefits is based on studies that try to take into account some of these other factors. So I think this is what the right answer is very difficult, but I don't think there's a clear argument one way or the other.
I just want to say very quickly, I think what Brian said at the end is exactly right. You can believe that compliance costs capture all the possible employment costs if you make the heroic assumption that the markets are functioning properly. And I just think it's very difficult to take a look at what's actually going on in the American economy right now, or even in these sort of micro cases of particular firms being regulated, to conclude that that's actually true. Just to provide one piece of evidence out of many, there's tremendous empirical evidence now of downward nominal wage rigidity. People's salaries are not really going down even in the face of massive unemployment. This is why unemployment is sort of a puzzle for economists generally, because they think, well, if markets are working perfectly, people should negotiate for lower wages and nobody loses their job. But that's simply not what we're seeing.
Yes.
This is in response to the point that Brian's making about employment considerations do not add any more information than you've already got with the compliance law. Imagine two different industries. The two industries have very different labor markets that they're drawing from. In industry A, you have a characteristic that people who lose their jobs find new jobs almost immediately, so that the transitional costs are minimal. In the other industry, the characteristics of the labor force and the labor markets that those workers are in are such that they have very long transition periods and so forth. Now, imagine two different regulations, one on industry A, one on industry B. When you calculate the direct compliance costs, they're exactly the same. Okay. So would you argue then that the welfare effects of the regulations on industry A and industry B are in fact the same?
I'll just say they may be distributed differently in those two industries. And generally, because several examples come up in the book that touch on human capital. And it sounds like the difference between those two industries is one of them. The workers have a lot of human capital invested in the specialized skill of that industry, or the other one not so much. But human capital, like physical capital, is sometimes varied by regulations. And in general, in the benefit cost analysis, we're not looking back at some costs. We're looking forward at the future stream of benefits and costs. And so I'm not sure how relevant that is. It certainly is relevant to individual workers. But again, you can't make inferences by looking at a particular group and saying, well, they're suffering a cost. And shouldn't that be counted? You can't make inferences from that about the social cost without looking at the complete picture and all the trade-offs.
So I think we're at the end of our time. I promised you at the beginning that this workshop would at least make very clear that these issues are much more complex than they are popularly portrayed in ordinary political discourse. I think we've delivered on that. You've seen that there are some different views about how to approach analyzing on this panel, whether to do it just through separate analyses, whether to incorporate it into benefit cost analysis, or whether to just focus solely on benefit cost analysis based upon compliance costs. Clearly, I want to thank the panelists here on the second panel, as with the first panel, and I want to thank each and every one of you for coming here today. These are important issues for our society, for our making public policy, and while there may be some differences in the experts, the research will go forward, and I think that is one of the things that I'm committed to, and I think most of the other panelists, is that these important questions for policymakers deserve the kind of attention from serious researchers that these folks have been giving it. So I want to thank them for their time and for continuing the pursuit of better understanding of the employment impacts of regulation. Thank you.